The battle begun. Cosette in her shadow, like Marius in his, was all ready to take fire. Destiny, with its mysterious and fatal patience, slowly drew together these two beings, all charged and all languishing with the stormy electricity of passion. These two souls which were laden with love as two clouds are laden with lightning, and which were bound to overflow and mingle in a look like the clouds in a flash of fire. The glance has been so much abused in love romances that it has finally fallen into disrepute. One hardly dares to say, nowadays, that two beings fell in love because they looked at each other. That is the way people do fall in love, nevertheless, and the only way. The rest is nothing, but the rest comes afterwards. Nothing is more real than these great shocks which two souls convey to each other by the exchange of that spark. At that particular hour when Cosette unconsciously darted that glance which troubled Marius, Marius had no suspicion that he had also launched a look which disturbed Cosette. He caused her the same good and the same evil. She had been in the habit of seeing him for a long time, and she had scrutinized him as girls scrutinize and see, while looking elsewhere. Marius still considered Cosette ugly, when she had already begun to think Marius handsome. But as he paid no attention to her, the young man was nothing to her. Still, she could not refrain from saying to herself that he had beautiful hair, beautiful eyes, handsome teeth, a charming tone of voice when she heard him conversing with his comrades, that he held himself badly when he walked, if you like, but with a grace that was all his own, that he did not appear to be at all stupid, that his whole person was noble, gentle, simple, proud, and that, in short, though he seemed to be poor, yet his air was fine. On the day when their eyes met at last, and said to each other those first, obscure, and ineffable things which the glance lisps, Cosette did not immediately understand. She returned thoughtfully to the house in the Rue de l'Ouest, where Jean Valjean, according to his custom, had come to spend 6 weeks. The next morning, on waking, she thought of that strange young man, so long indifferent and icy, who now seemed to pay attention to her, and it did not appear to her that this attention was the least in the world agreeable to her. She was, on the contrary, somewhat incensed at this handsome and disdainful individual. A substratum of war stirred within her. It struck her, and the idea caused her a wholly childish joy, that she was going to take her revenge at last. Knowing that she was beautiful, she was thoroughly conscious, though in an indistinct fashion, that she possessed a weapon. Women play with their beauty as children do with a knife. They wound themselves. The reader will recall Marius' hesitations, his palpitations, his terrors. He remained on his bench and did not approach. This vexed Cosette. One day, she said to Jean Valjean, "Father, let us stroll about a little in that direction." Seeing that Marius did not come to her, she went to him. In such cases, all women resemble Mahomet. And then, strange to say, the first symptom of true love in a young man is timidity. In a young girl it is boldness. This is surprising, and yet nothing is more simple. It is the two sexes tending to approach each other and assuming, each the other's qualities. That day, Cosette's glance drove Marius beside himself, and Marius' glance set Cosette to trembling. Marius went away confident, and Cosette uneasy. From that day forth, they adored each other. The first thing that Cosette felt was a confused and profound melancholy. It seemed to her that her soul had become black since the day before. She no longer recognized it. The whiteness of soul in young girls, which is composed of coldness and gaiety, resembles snow. It melts in love, which is its sun. Cosette did not know what love was. She had never heard the word uttered in its terrestrial sense. On the books of profane music which entered the convent, amour, love, was replaced by tambour, drum, or pandor. This created enigmas which exercised the imaginations of the big girls, such as, "Ah, how delightful is the drum!" or, "Pity is not a Pandore." But Cosette had left the convent too early to have occupied herself much with the drum. Therefore, she did not know what name to give to what she now felt. Is anyone the less ill because one does not know the name of one's malady? She loved with all the more passion because she loved ignorantly. She did not know whether it was a good thing or a bad thing, useful or dangerous, eternal or temporary, allowable or prohibited. She loved. She would have been greatly astonished, had anyone said to her, "You do not sleep? But that is forbidden. You do not eat? Why, that is very bad. You have oppressions and palpitations of the heart? That must not be. You blush and turn pale, when a certain being clad in black appears at the end of a certain green walk. But that is abominable." She would not have understood, and she would have replied, "What fault is there of mine in a matter in which I have no power and of which I know nothing?" It turned out that the love which presented itself was exactly suited to the state of her soul. It was a sort of admiration at a distance, a mute contemplation, the deification of a stranger. It was the apparition of youth to youth. The dream of nights become a reality yet remaining a dream, the longed-for phantom realized and made flesh at last, but having as yet, neither name, nor fault, nor spot, nor exigence, nor defect. In a word, the distant lover who lingered in the ideal, a chimera with a form. Any nearer and more palpable meeting would have alarmed Cosette at this first stage, when she was still half immersed in the exaggerated mists of the cloister. She had all the fears of children and all the fears of nuns combined. The spirit of the convent, with which she had been permeated for the space of 5 years, was still in the process of slow evaporation from her person, and made everything tremble around her. In this situation he was not a lover, he was not even an admirer, he was a vision. She set herself to adoring Marius as something charming, luminous, and impossible. As extreme innocence borders on extreme coquetry, she smiled at him with all frankness. Every day, she looked forward to the hour for their walk with impatience. She found Marius there, she felt herself unspeakably happy, and thought in all sincerity that she was expressing her whole thought when she said to Jean Valjean, "What a delicious garden that Luxembourg is." Marius and Cosette were in the dark as to one another. They did not address each other, they did not salute each other, they did not know each other. They saw each other, and like stars of heaven which are separated by millions of leagues, they lived by gazing at each other. It was thus that Cosette gradually became a woman and developed, beautiful and loving, with a consciousness of her beauty, and in ignorance of her love. She was a coquette to boot through her ignorance. Chapter 7. To one sadness oppose a sadness and a half. All situations have their instincts. Old and eternal Mother Nature warned Jean Valjean in a dim way of the presence of Marius. Jean Valjean shuddered to the very bottom of his soul. Jean Valjean saw nothing, knew nothing, and yet he scanned with obstinate attention the darkness in which he walked, as though he felt on one side of him something in process of construction, and on the other, something which was crumbling away. Marius, also warned, and, in accordance with the deep law of God, by that same Mother Nature, did all he could to keep out of sight of the Father. Nevertheless, it came to pass that Jean Valjean sometimes espied him. Marius' manners were no longer in the least natural. He exhibited ambiguous prudence and awkward daring. He no longer came quite close to them as formerly. He seated himself at a distance and pretended to be reading. Why did he pretend that? Formerly he had come in his old coat, now he wore his new one every day. Jean Valjean was not sure that he did not have his hair curled, his eyes were very queer, he wore gloves. In short, Jean Valjean cordially detested this young man. Cosette allowed nothing to be divined. Without knowing just what was the matter with her, she was convinced that there was something in it, and that it must be concealed. There was a coincidence between the taste for the toilet which had recently come to Cosette, and the habit of new clothes developed by that stranger which was very repugnant to Jean Valjean. It might be accidental, no doubt, certainly, but it was a menacing accident. He never opened his mouth to Cosette about this stranger. One day, however, he could not refrain from so doing, and, with that vague despair which suddenly casts the lead into the depths of its despair, he said to her, "What a very pedantic air that young man has." Cosette, but a year before only an indifferent little girl, would have replied, "Why, no, he is charming." 10 years later, with the love of Marius in her heart, she would have answered, "A pedant, and insufferable to the sight." You are right. At the moment in life and the heart which she had then attained, she contented herself with replying, with supreme calmness, "That young man." As though she now beheld him for the first time in her life. "How stupid I am," thought Jean Valjean. She had not noticed him. It is I who have pointed him out to her. Oh, simplicity of the old. Oh, the depth of children. It is one of the laws of those fresh years of suffering and trouble. Of those vivacious conflicts between a first love and the first obstacles, that the young girl does not allow herself to be caught in any trap whatever, and that the young man falls into every one. Jean Valjean had instituted an undeclared war against Marius, which Marius, with the sublime stupidity of his passion and his age, did not divine. Jean Valjean laid a host of ambushes for him. He changed his hour, he changed his bench, he forgot his handkerchief, he came alone to the Luxembourg. Marius dashed headlong into all these snares. And to all the interrogation marks planted by Jean Valjean in his pathway, he ingenuously answered yes. But Cosette remained immured in her apparent unconcern and in her imperturbable tranquillity, so that Jean Valjean arrived at the following conclusion. That ninny is madly in love with Cosette, but Cosette does not even know that he exists. None the less did he bear in his heart a mournful tremor. The minute when Cosette would love might strike at any moment. Does not everything begin with indifference? Only once did Cosette make a mistake and alarm him. He rose from his seat to depart, after a stay of 3 hours, and she said, "What, already?" Jean Valjean had not discontinued his trips to the Luxembourg, as he did not wish to do anything out of the way, and as, above all things, he feared to arouse Cosette. But during the hours which were so sweet to the lovers, while Cosette was sending her smile to the intoxicated Marius, who perceived nothing else now, and who now saw nothing in all the world but an adored and radiant face, Jean Valjean was fixing on Marius flashing and terrible eyes. He, who had finally come to believe himself incapable of a malevolent feeling, experienced moments when Marius was present, in which he thought he was becoming savage and ferocious once more. And he felt the old depths of his soul, which had formerly contained so much wrath, opening once more and rising up against that young man. It almost seemed to him that unknown craters were forming in his bosom. What? He was there, that creature. What was he there for? He came creeping about, smelling out, examining, trying. He came, saying, "Hey, why not?" He came to prowl about his, Jean Valjean's, life. To prowl about his happiness, with the purpose of seizing it and bearing it away. Jean Valjean added, "Yes, that's it. What is he in search of? An adventure. What does he want? A love affair. A love affair. And I? What? I have been first. The most wretched of men. And then the most unhappy. And I have traversed 60 years of life on my knees. I have suffered everything that man can suffer. I have grown old without having been young. I have lived without a family. Without relatives. Without friends. Without life. Without children. I have left my blood on every stone. On every bramble. On every milepost. Along every wall. I have been gentle. Though others have been hard to me. And kind. Although others have been malicious. I have become an honest man once more. In spite of everything. I have repented of the evil that I have done and have forgiven the evil that has been done to me. And at the moment when I receive my recompense. At the moment when it is all over. At the moment when I am just touching the goal. At the moment when I have what I desire. It is well. It is good. I have paid. I have earned it. All this is to take flight, all this will vanish, and I shall lose Cosette, and I shall lose my life, my joy, my soul, because it has pleased a great booby to come and lounge at the Luxembourg. Then his eyes were filled with a sad and extraordinary gleam. It was no longer a man gazing at a man. It was no longer an enemy surveying an enemy. It was a dog scanning a thief. The reader knows the rest. Marius pursued his senseless course. One day he followed Cosette to the Rue de l'Ouest. Another day he spoke to the porter. The porter, on his side, spoke, and said to Jean Valjean, "Monsieur, who is that curious young man who is asking for you?" On the morrow Jean Valjean bestowed on Marius that glance which Marius at last perceived. A week later, Jean Valjean had taken his departure. He swore to himself that he would never again set foot either in the Luxembourg or in the Rue de l'Ouest. He returned to the Rue Plumet. Cosette did not complain, she said nothing, she asked no questions, she did not seek to learn his reasons. She had already reached the point where she was afraid of being divined, and of betraying herself. Jean Valjean had no experience of these miseries, the only miseries which are charming and the only ones with which he was not acquainted. The consequence was that he did not understand the grave significance of Cosette's silence. He merely noticed that she had grown sad, and he grew gloomy. On his side and on hers, inexperience had joined issue. Once he made a trial. He asked Cosette, "Would you like to come to the Luxembourg?" A ray illuminated Cosette's pale face. "Yes," said she. They went thither. 3 months had elapsed. Marius no longer went there. Marius was not there. On the following day, Jean Valjean asked Cosette again, "Would you like to come to the Luxembourg?" She replied, sadly and gently, "No." Jean Valjean was hurt by this sadness, and heartbroken at this gentleness. What was going on in that mind which was so young and yet already so impenetrable? What was on its way there within? What was taking place in Cosette's soul? Sometimes, instead of going to bed, Jean Valjean remained seated on his pallet, with his head in his hands, and he passed whole nights asking himself, "What has Cosette in her mind?" and in thinking of the things that she might be thinking about. Oh, at such moments, what mournful glances did he cast towards that cloister, that chaste peak, that abode of angels, that inaccessible glacier of virtue. How he contemplated, with despairing ecstasy, that convent garden, full of ignored flowers and cloistered virgins, where all perfumes and all souls mount straight to heaven. How he adored that Eden forever closed against him, whence he had voluntarily and madly emerged. How he regretted his abnegation and his folly in having brought Cosette back into the world, poor hero of sacrifice, seized and hurled to the earth by his very self-devotion. How he said to himself, "What have I done?" However, nothing of all this was perceptible to Cosette. No ill temper, no harshness. His face was always serene and kind. Jean Valjean's manners were more tender and more paternal than ever. If anything could have betrayed his lack of joy, it was his increased suavity. On her side, Cosette languished. She suffered from the absence of Marius as she had rejoiced in his presence, peculiarly, without exactly being conscious of it. When Jean Valjean ceased to take her on the customary strolls, a feminine instinct murmured confusedly, at the bottom of her heart, that she must not seem to set store on the Luxembourg garden, and that if this proved to be a matter of indifference to her, her father would take her thither once more. But days, weeks, months, elapsed. Jean Valjean had tacitly accepted Cosette's tacit consent. She regretted it. It was too late. So Marius had disappeared. All was over. The day on which she returned to the Luxembourg, Marius was no longer there. What was to be done? Should she ever find him again? She felt an anguish at her heart, which nothing relieved, and which augmented every day. She no longer knew whether it was winter or summer, whether it was raining or shining, whether the birds were singing, whether it was the season for dahlias or daisies, whether the Luxembourg was more charming than the Tuileries, whether the linen which the laundress brought home was starched too much or not enough, whether Toussaint had done her marketing well or ill. And she remained dejected, absorbed, attentive to but a single thought, her eyes vague and staring as when one gazes by night at a black and fathomless spot where an apparition has vanished. However, she did not allow Jean Valjean to perceive anything of this, except her pallor. She still wore her sweet face for him. This pallor sufficed, but too thoroughly to trouble Jean Valjean. Sometimes he asked her, "What is the matter with you?" She replied, "There is nothing the matter with me." And after a silence, when she divined that he was sad also, she would add, "And you, father, is there anything wrong with you?" "With me? Nothing," said he. These two beings who had loved each other so exclusively, and with so touching an affection, and who had lived so long for each other now suffered side by side, each on the other's account. Without acknowledging it to each other, without anger towards each other, and with a smile.